Chapter 10, in which Mendenbar decides to experiment. Mendenbar stared at the window, angrier than he could remember being in a long time. In the back of his mind, he could hear a voice reminding him that the King of the Dragons was no concern of the King of the Enchanted Forest, and that the Society of Wizards was a dangerous group to offend or interfere with. He could hear another voice that sounded very much like Willen's, suggesting envoys and formal complaints, but he was in no mood to pay attention to either of them. Mendenbar was not going to stand by and let the Society of Wizards kidnap and imprison anyone, King of the Dragons or not. Huh, said the dwarf. So you weren't kidding about looking for that dragon? Of course not, Cimmerian snapped. Her eyes were fixed on the window, and there was a little crease between her eyebrows. But where are they? Window, show me where they are. Magic rose up around the window in a great wave, and Mendenbar felt an answering surge in his sword. The window turned bright green, glowing brighter and brighter, then suddenly shattered into dust. Hey, said the dwarf, my window! Drat. Cimmerian's hands clenched into fists, and she glared at the empty space where the window had been. After a moment, she shook her head and turned to the dwarf. I'm sorry, Herman. I didn't know that it would do that, and we don't really know any more than we did before. Oh, yes, we do, Mendenbar said. We know that some wizards have captured Kazul, and we know that they're somewhere in the Enchanted Forest. We do? I'm sure of it. I think that's why the window couldn't show a more general picture of where they were. Things in the Enchanted Forest move around a lot, especially if the forest doesn't like something. I'll bet my crown on that. Mendenbar waved at the empty window frame. That is something the Enchanted Forest doesn't like one bit. All right, but it doesn't help much, Cimmerian said. The Enchanted Forest is a big place. How are we going to find them? That won't be a problem, Mendenbar said. I'm the king of the Enchanted Forest, remember? That makes you good at finding missing dragons? It makes me good at finding out what's going on, Mendenbar said. I can tell when places are moving around, and I can get where I want to go, even when it's moving. I don't think that it will be too hard once we get back inside the Enchanted Forest. Then let's go, Cimmerian said. I didn't like the look of that bubble thing those wizards had around Kazul. At least they didn't seem to hurt her, Mendenbar offered. That's true. I wish I knew what they were up to. Cimmerian scowled at the broken window, then turned sharply away, almost running into the dwarf. I don't understand this at all, said the dwarf, looking from Cimmerian to Mendenbar with a puzzled frown. I'm sorry that we don't have time to explain, Mendenbar said, but I'm afraid that we just don't. Thank you for your help, Cimmerian added. The dwarf shook his head and led them to the front door, frowning in such deep concentration the whole time that neither Mendenbar nor Cimmerian could bring themselves to interrupt. In the doorway, the dwarf paused. Are you sure you don't want any gold? Quite sure, Mendenbar said. We have a long walk ahead of us, and gold is awfully heavy. I thought you didn't want to spin gold anymore, Cimmerian added. The dwarf looked down. It's not the spinning, it's the rest of it, he said, not very clearly. And spinning's the only way I know how to make money, and you wouldn't believe how fast kids grow. Oh, said Cimmerian. She bit her lip. What if I asked you to spin some gold for us and then let you keep it? She said without much help. No, said the dwarf. I tried it once and it just doesn't work. Can you spin it for the children? They asked. The dwarf shook his head. They're my responsibility, so it's the same as spinning it for myself as far as the spell's concerned. What are you going to do with them all? Cimmerian asked, as renewed shrieks and the sound of pounding feet came through the open door. Oh, most of them will grow up and save their kingdoms from something or other in the nick of time, the dwarf said. Long lost heirs, you know. That's what makes it so difficult. I have to see that they're properly trained on top of everything. Training, Mendenbar said under his breath. He squinted into the sunlight, trying to catch hold of an idea that hovered just out of reach. I don't suppose they're parents, Cimmerian's voice trailed off as the dwarf shook his head. A bargain's a bargain. Besides, it wouldn't be the same without them running all over. I can't give them back. Of course not, Mendenbar said, blinking. He smiled suddenly. But you can charge for training them, can't you? An answering smile lit Cimmerian's face. A boarding school for long-lost heirs. What a good idea. A school? The dwarf said, as if the words tasted kind of funny. A boarding school? I don't know. Why not? Cimmerian said. It would solve your money problems for sure. Special schools are always horribly expensive. You could charge the parents of your children for the training part and take on a few more kids at training, plus full room and board. The dwarf's eyes gleamed at the idea, but then his face fell. What about my spinning? He said. It is a family tradition. Cimmerian rolled her eyes. Haven't you done enough of that already? Well, I have an idea about that too, Mendenbar put in. The problem with spells is that you can't spin for yourself or for anyone who's your responsibility, right? That's it in a nutshell, the dwarf said, and there's nothing to be done about it. What if you set up a scholarship fund? Mendenbar said. I'll bet a really good lawyer could design one so that you could work around the spell's restrictions so you could spin for it. Cimmerian nodded. A good lawyer can get around just about anything, and if that doesn't work, you could spin for other scholarship funds and only take part of the gold, as you usually do. I never thought of spinning for a fund, the dwarf said in wonder. You think on it then, Mendenbar said. We have to go. Yes, said Cimmerian. I won't feel quite comfortable until I know that Kazul is out of that bubble. Thank you again. They left the dwarf in the doorway, muttering to himself about rooms and expenses, and walked over to the rolled-up carpet. Mendenbar looked at it with distaste, remembering their wild ride. He hoped Cimmerian wasn't going to insist on using it right away. His stomach hadn't completely settled from the last time, and he turned his head. Cimmerian was looking at him with a wary expression. Let's carry it for a while, she suggested. The children are probably watching, and we shouldn't give them any ideas. Right, Mendenbar said with relief. Do you want the front end or the back? Cimmerian took the back end, and they hoisted the carpet to their shoulders and started off. Walking with the carpet was surprisingly easy. Cimmerian was a good match for Mendenbar in height, and she was quite strong. Mendenbar supposed it must be from carrying around dragon-sized servings of lamb and beef, and before he thought, he said as much. Actually, it's the chocolate mousse in the cherries jubilee, Cimmerian said. I didn't think chocolate mousse was particularly heavy. It is when you've got a bucket full in each hand, Cimmerian retorted. Oh, said Mendenbar. Yes, I suppose it would be. He was trying to figure out how much a bucket of mousse would weigh when the carpet jerked suddenly. Mendenbar grabbed at it, thinking, oh no, is it going to start dancing around on its own? Then he realized the carpet had jerked because Cimmerian had stopped. He looked reproachfully over his shoulder. It's time for lunch, Cimmerian said. All this talk about food is making me hungry, and I don't want to have to face a lot of wizards on an empty stomach. Now that she mentioned it, he was hungry too. Good idea, Mendenbar said with enthusiasm. And this looks like a nice spot to stop. Will you serve, or shall I? Cimmerian laughed. They set the rolled-up carpet on a stretch of grass between two pines and got out Valamore's package, then sat down to see what the giantess had sent along with them. It was, as Mendenbar had expected, an enormous quantity of food. 7 fat pastries stuffed with chicken and herbs, a large bottle of cold spring water, a round loaf of bread, and a generous wedge of yellow cheese, 4 large red apples, and a small box filled with wonderful creamy chocolate fudge. My goodness, Cimmerian said when they had unpacked everything. Valamore certainly believes in feeding people well. Look at all of this. No, Mendenbar said, picking up one of the pastries and handing it to Cimmerian. Don't look at it, just eat it. I wonder where she got the fudge, Cimmerian said. Everything else is probably from the Cauldron of Plenty, but it doesn't do desserts very well. Maybe she made it herself. I hope so, Cimmerian smiled at Mendebar's look of surprise. If she did, I can ask her for the recipe. By an unspoken mutual agreement, neither Mendenbar nor Cimmerian mentioned Kazul or the wizards during lunch, though they were both certainly thinking about them. Instead, they had a pleasant talk about some of the odd and interesting people they had met over the past few years. Cimmerian knew a lot of unusual folk. Many of them were dragons, of course, but her position as Kazul's chief cook and librarian meant that she had also met most of the visitors from outside of the Mountains of Mourning, who came to pay their respects to the King of the Dragons or to ask her questions. Near the end of the meal, Mendebar noticed that Cimmerian was gazing at him intently. No, not at him, at his sword. What is it? Mendebar asked worriedly. Have you been doing things with your sword again? Cimmerian demanded. No, Mendebar said, puzzled. I used it on your sink to stop the nightshade and when the carpet started falling, but that's all. Why? Because it's leaking magic all over the place, Cimmerian said. I thought so before, but now I'm positive. She finished her second pastry and stood up, brushing crumbs in her lap. The sheath must not be working as well as I thought. Would you mind letting me look at it without the sword? Mendebar stood up and drew his sword. Cimmerian flinched. Is something wrong? I don't know, Cimmerian said. Can't you feel it? Feel what? Your sword. It isn't the sheath after all. It's that dreaded sword, and it's gotten worse. Put it away, quickly. Thoroughly puzzled, Mendebar did as Cimmerian asked. All right, he said. Now, would you please explain? I'm not sure I can, Cimmerian said. You didn't know what I meant before when I said that your sword reeked of magic, so I suppose it's reasonable that you can't tell that the reek is twice as strong now. You'll just have to take my word for it. Mendebar looked down at the sword, thinking hard. It's linked to the enchanted forest, and I've never taken it out of the woods before, he said at last. Maybe it doesn't like it. Maybe it's trying to make the mountains more like the enchanted forest. It sounded silly to put it that way, but he couldn't think of how else to say it. It would sound even sillier if he told her that he thought the sword was trying to stuff some magic into the empty, barren-feeling land around him. Cimmerian said, gazing absently at the sword. After a moment, she looked up. I bet you're right. Bother, that means we have to use the carpet. She bent and started packing up the remains of their lunch. Wait a minute, Mendebar said. What has my sword got to do with that carpet? Well, if being outside the enchanted forest is what makes your sword behave like a magic beacon, then we have to get it back inside the enchanted forest as fast as we can, Cimmerian explained patiently. Otherwise, every ogre and wizard for leagues and leagues around us will come looking for whatever's making the fuss. And the carpet is a lot faster than walking. I don't trust it. We managed before, and it ought to be easier now that we know what to expect. Here, help me. She knelt and began unrolling the carpet as she spoke. Do we know what to expect? Remembering the bumping, spinning, and unpredictable ride, Mendebar shuddered. Look, I don't like it any better than you do, but we have to do something about that sword. Besides, the sooner we get to the forest, the sooner you can find out where those wizards have Kazul. And do we have any other choice? I could probably use the sword to get us to the enchanted forest, Mendebar suggested. Cimmerian sat back on her heels, staring at him. You can do that? Why on earth didn't you do that to begin with? We could have gone straight to Kazul's grandchildren's cave to save a lot of time. I didn't mention it before because I'm not really sure it'll work, Mendebar said. I've never tried that particular spell outside the enchanted forest before, and it wouldn't be a good idea to test it for the first time to get somewhere I'd never been, especially somewhere that isn't in the enchanted forest either. Actually, he hadn't tried any of his usual spells outside of the enchanted forest before, for a very good reason. That he hadn't been outside of the enchanted forest since he'd become king and started working magic. But he didn't like to mention that in front of Cimmerian. He was quite sure that if she had suddenly become the ruler of a magical kingdom, she would have tested all of her new spells and powers and abilities immediately, under as many conditions as she could have come up with. He didn't want her to think that he was careless or neglectful. So we can either experiment with the carpet again or experiment with your spell, Cimmerian said. She scowled thoughtfully. Sorry, I lost my spot. At the teddy bears, then looked up at Mendenbar and smiled. Let's try the spell. What do you want me to do? Just stand there, Mendenbar said, returning her smile. I've never worked with another magician, and one experiment at a time is enough. My goodness. Why hadn't you? Cimmerian asked as she climbed to her feet. Worked with another magician, I mean. From what you were telling me yesterday, you've got more than enough work for a couple of assistants. I've never had any time to find any assistants, Mendenbar said, except Willen, my steward, and he's never learned much magic. You mean you're trying to run the whole enchanted forest all by yourself? Cimmerian said. You're as bad as the dragons. What? It took me 6 months to persuade them that the king of the dragons didn't need to do everything all the time, Cimmerian explained. And then it took me another 3 months to get a system set up so they wouldn't keep running to Kazul with every little problem. You set that up? How? I mean, how did you know? Mendenbar's voice trailed off. To his surprise, Cimmerian flushed slightly. I studied a lot of unusual things when I was growing up, she said. Unusual for a princess, I mean. Politics was one of them. It sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing for a princess to study to me, Mendenbar said. Look how useful it's been. Well, it's not one of the things a princess is supposed to learn, Cimmerian said. You wouldn't believe the fuss they made when they found out I'd taken my protocol teacher to covering it. What were you supposed to be learning then? Cimmerian made a face. Embroidery and dancing and etiquette and proper behavior. No wonder princesses are silly. If that's all they're supposed to know about, Mendenbar said without thinking. He blinked and added hastily, Not you. I mean, you aren't silly, even if you are a princess. I mean, don't try to explain any more. You'll only make it worse, Cimmerian said, laughing. Now, hadn't we better try that spell? We are in a bit of a hurry, remember? So, that is where we're going to leave off for today. Predictions for what's going to happen when they try the spell, or with the new information we've learned about Cimmerian.